All right. So, hello everybody, and welcome to this Ask the Author session hosted by the International Transport Forum at the OECD. The ITF's Ask the Author series provides quick-fire 30-minute rundowns of specific transport-related issues. This session is going out live via Zoom and is also being shown on YouTube and LinkedIn. So, welcome to you all, wherever you are today. And basically, our Ask the Author sessions work like this. We invite an author of a recently published ITF report to give you a brief presentation of the report's main findings and recommendations. Then we invite you, the audience, to pose questions. Today, we're going to talk about automated vehicles, or AVs for short. As many of you know, AVs already exist and are capable of driving on today's roads. While most AVs currently operate in testing environments, they're expected to become more widespread in the future. But AVs have very different requirements than cars wholly controlled by human drivers. What kind of infrastructure and institutional frameworks should we prepare for when AVs become a common sight on our roads? To take us through the complexities of this emerging issue, we're joined today by Michael Dnes, who is the head of Future Road Technologies at the Department for Transport in the United Kingdom. Michael co-chaired an ITF working group, which produced the ITF research report, Preparing Infrastructure for Automated Vehicles, which we published last month. Michael will take us through the main findings, and then we'll provide you with an opportunity to ask your questions via the chat function. But for now, over to you, Michael.
Thank you, David, and thank you for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to talk to everyone around the world. So since 2020, we've been working together to explore a crucial question. What should we be doing to prepare the world's roads for the arrival of automated vehicles? When this study began, I led the development of the UK's 5-year roads programme. My team had to develop our government's long-term plans for dealing with a number of technological developments. There was one question, however, I was really worried about being asked. I knew that if my minister called us into his office and said, "I want to make automated vehicles arrive faster. Here's £100 million to spend on upgrading our busiest roads. Where should we spend it?" I would have had to answer him that, "I'm sorry, we don't have an answer to that question yet." And that worried me a lot. So when the ITF asked for some new research topics, we suggested this might be an interesting question to explore. And it turns out we were not alone. A total of 17 countries got involved in this report, all of whom were asking themselves the same question. What kind of actions can we take today to support the arrival of automated vehicles? Before I get stuck in, I'd like to take a moment to thank my co-chair, Martin Rus, as well as Ida Joachim Acosta and Ito Pilisivola for their efforts in leading key parts of the work, and to Katja Schechner and to Veronique Fepal for their work organising us on behalf of the ITF. And you can see a copy of the report just here. Please, I think there's a link to the download in the chat already. Now, it's useful to reflect for a moment on how infrastructure relates to the operation of automated vehicles. We have a well-developed intellectual framework for considering the automation of vehicles. The Society of Automotive Engineers levels of automation have given us a useful framework to understand how automated a vehicle is and how much responsibility that vehicle takes for the driving task. But we have much less sense about how infrastructure relates to that. Until you have a go anywhere, a level 5 automated vehicle, every automated vehicle is going to work in some places, but not in others. Well, what determines whether technology works? You could call it the vehicle's environment or its operational design domain if you're technically minded. But in some ways, it could be defined as the infrastructure that that vehicle is driving on. Now, that poses some interesting challenges for us. Firstly, I'm a former transport historian. I'm conscious that automated vehicles are not the first automated transport systems we've ever built. To get to work today, I took London's Victoria line, which had been driverless since it opened in 1967. Now, that technical challenge was solved by creating a sealed and purpose-built environment where automation could be safely delivered using technology no more complicated than a computer floppy disk. And the emerging law on automated vehicles also stresses the importance of infrastructure. So, for example, the new German law on automated vehicles allows those vehicles to operate only on the Autobahn under defined conditions. So we know infrastructure matters. We're much less sure on how it matters. A lot of effort is going now into making an array of sensors that let a vehicle see the road, but we know very little about how to make that road more visible to those sensors. And this is an important gap in our knowledge. And to write our report, we didn't just rely on discussions amongst policy officials. We made a point of reaching out and talking to different players across industry, people who are responsible for making automated vehicles usable in the real world. So what did we find out? I'd like to highlight 3 key findings. The first is about the road itself. When we began, we had a lot of questions about what we should be doing with our roads. People have talked about creating dedicated lanes for automated traffic, or thinking about how to build roads that are well suited to the requirements of automated vehicles. And this is an important question for us because we build assets with a lifespan of 100 years or more. We have to live with the consequences. But is there an automation-ready road standard we can build to today? Well, we don't think there is yet. That's partly because the technology is moving fast, and we don't yet have much evidence to use in actually saying what is and isn't useful. But the real issue is arguably something more fundamental. Developers aren't waiting for the right infrastructure to be put in place. They want to create vehicles that can drive as widely as possible. If they could design a vehicle which would only work on a few kilometers of dedicated track, they'd have a very small market to sell their vehicles to. But if they can drive on all the world's roads, or even all the world's motorways or high-grade highways, their commercial opportunities are far larger. So they are much more interested in using the roads that already exist. Not only that, but waiting for government to roll out infrastructure takes a long time. Most developers only have a few years of funding at their disposal. So they take the road network as it stands, and they try to get results with what's already there. There are some areas where we can say things are more likely to become more important. The visibility of road signs and road markings was talked about quite a lot. But to turn these observations into a proper standard will take more time and more research. Where there is much more interest is away from the physical infrastructure, in areas like digital connectivity, data, law, and administration. We call this invisible infrastructure, although recently I've heard people talking about digital infrastructure in much the same way. Despite saying that these companies want to use the physical road network in the state it's already in, developers of these vehicles are actually relying on many things that we don't traditionally think of as being part of road infrastructure. One of the most obvious is satellite-based navigation, or GNSS. Every automated vehicle uses this, alongside other methods, to understand where it is. Another element is connectivity between the vehicle and the rest of the world. At a minimum, automated vehicles use the internet and other types of connectivity to remain informed about their surroundings. At most, some automated vehicles are using systems such as teleassist, which give remote instructions to automated vehicles when they face complex situations, which might mean connectivity becoming close to safety critical in some cases. And then there's high-definition mapping. Not all developers use these maps, but many do. And if you want to look for where the heaviest investment in what might be more loosely called infrastructure is for automated vehicles, it would be in these maps, where developers are often spending quite a lot of their own money making sure that they've got good ones available. And what those maps say does have significant implications for how and where automated vehicles will operate. And these things aren't things which government currently has much of a control over. Now, this is good news and bad news. The bad news is that these tend to be topics that transport ministries and infrastructure operators see as outside of their areas of responsibility. That probably won't be sustainable based on recent trends. And there will be a growing pressure to have policies that links into those things that are necessary for automated vehicles to operate safely and well. But the good news is that most of these things aren't actually very expensive technologies to deploy. It sounds very costly to talk about creating a high-definition map of the core road network of a nation. But Korea has delivered one for about $1,600 a kilometre. At that level, it would cost less than about 10 million to map the entire UK motorway network, for example. And that very faithfully to conventional capital projects, where costs might run into many times that sum. Now, though these high-tech interventions are not the only thing that are important to automated vehicles, you may want, if you want to have the one thing where developers were desperate to see government action, they repeatedly asked for a better flow of basic data about the day-to-day operation of the road network. We might like to flatter ourselves as policy officials and infrastructure operators that our great contribution should be in high-tech elements like communications relays or satellites or cutting-edge digital systems. But our greatest contribution might actually be in providing the basic information about things like traffic regulations or roadworks, especially if we can do it in real time. There's real industry frustration with how slow this is, how human-led it is, how labor-intensive it is. Ultimately, it is very hard to explain to the man or woman from Google why it is that the huge quantities of key information that we have are held on pieces of paper some of the time. Or to a 21-year-old digital startup owner, who is why the variable messaging sign above our heads doesn't talk to the sat-nav that's in their dashboards. This is one of the clearest places where the administrative practices we developed in the previous century do not deliver the expectations of the future. And if we want to fix one thing now with zero regrets, this is probably it. One last point, and I'll try and stay brief about this. Most of us in the study came from backgrounds in transport policy making or infrastructure management. This is a world that hasn't changed much in the past 50 years. As a profession, we've worked to keep the system that we run stable and effective. As we worked on the study, I think many of us became increasingly aware that the world ahead will be different. If the roads today are very similar to those from 50 years ago, the roads 50 years in the future will run in a more complex way, which we're not yet able to describe very well. And we as a profession will need to understand and oversee how those new challenges are met. We will have to manage unfamiliar risks. We will need to work with limited information, which are things we don't normally do right now. There will be years when the amount of uncertainty will feel uncomfortable to us, whereas before we could work comfortably within our own jurisdictions. Now we will have problems that apply across borders. We will all have questions, and relatively few of us will have the answers to them. Now, I would argue that this study has shown that those uncertainties are best met together through new partnerships that span different institutions and organizations, and which, in particular, unite policymakers with developers and other industry representatives. Working with people who think differently to us is one of the most powerful tools available to us as we approach the challenges ahead. I think it's a very brief summary of what we were talking about. I should probably hand back to David at this point to take some of the questions and answers. This topic always generates more questions than we have answers to. I'm interested to hear what everyone has to say.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that brief but very informative presentation. Having worked on editing the final report, I understand the challenge of trying to compress the knowledge that's contained into the report within a very brief presentation. So thank you very much for that. We're now moving on to the second part of our discussion, as Michael alluded to. This is where we ask for your input, your questions for Michael. If you could do so via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens, that would be terrific. We're getting some questions coming in now, but before we start, perhaps if you'll allow me, Michael, to pose a question of my own to begin with. A question for those of us who may be coming to this issue with very fresh eyes or from a very recent perspective with very little knowledge of automated vehicles. The report refers to various levels of driving automation from level 0 to level 5, and you referred to level 5 automation at the beginning of your presentation. Without going too deeply into the details, could you give us an idea of some of the main differences between those two contrasting levels of automation?
Sure. So at the most basic end, level 0 vehicle is one that is completely unautomated. It's a simple piece of metal that is working entirely under the control of the driver. Level 5 automation will be something which is fully capable of driving in any environment at all. And for those interested in the history, that really does mean any environment at all. The ideas behind autonomy actually come from the US military, where there was a request from Congress to have combat vehicles that could drive in any circumstance. So we're talking about hills, mountains, forests, Antarctic wastelands, anywhere. The interesting one is probably level 4, which is the level at which it's able to drive in some places, but not in others. It can drive totally under the control of the vehicle, so there's no expectation that the driver should intervene except in, so that any human should intervene except in an emergency. But it won't go everywhere. And that's where the question of this interesting paradigm comes in, where we need to understand where it will work and where it will not. It's not something that people have discussed very much, and therefore it could be that this is a complete non-issue for many countries. The road network may already be very well developed for our needs, but it doesn't have that kind of systematic breakdown of knowledge that we've been able to have through those SAE levels. Now, to preempt a question that normally comes in is alongside this, has anyone tried to create levels for the road network? Yes, to an extent we have. It's particularly on communications technology, where there is, I think, a neater breakdown of what the road network can and can't do and what levels of interaction you can put on top of it. The European Sea Roads Initiative has got some very useful ideas in this space, which some members of my team are very happily involved in. But we don't have a sense of a broad spectrum of capabilities that the infrastructure might have that would naturally mirror where we are with the SAE levels for vehicle automation. And I'm not necessarily sure it's possible, given the nature of how technology advances with the vehicles at such a rapid pace.
Thank you, Michael. And I do have one more sort of small follow-up question to that. I thought you were going to reveal my follow-up question, but it's slightly different. So you know, the report talks about the fact that the automated vehicles have been expected to become widespread for some time now, and that initial kind of perhaps futurist euphoria has given way to a bit more of a sober analysis of the reality of the likely time frame for the emergence of automated vehicles. But I mean, if you could gaze into the crystal ball, you know, how long do you think it will be until we see, until it is a common sight on our roads for vehicles with, say, SAE level 4 automation, you know, to be interacting with the roads worldwide?
It's a really tricky question, and if I was sensible, I wouldn't dare to answer it. But I will give it a go. Certainly, there's I think a consensus that level 5 automation is a good way off. That we're talking a decade or more with most people that you're talking to, and it could easily be never, conceivably, given how broadly level 5 is defined. I think that the answer to this is driven by more than just technology. A lot of people were very interested in how the technology for this could be developed in the last decade. So the reason you have very optimistic forecasts of how soon you could see automated vehicles on the road in the mid-2010s was because there had been a really huge explosion in the power of machine vision and the ability to go and decode what a camera said, and then use that to go and say, this is what the road contains around you, and therefore a vehicle could deal with it. But that left two significant gaps. One of them is around the AI actually letting the vehicle predict what's going to happen next, the driving AI, if you will, which has moved slower than that image processing technology has, and has held back the development of these vehicles. But secondly, there's a risk appetite. There are human questions that sit behind this. How ready are you to trust a vehicle to drive itself? Now, when we were talking with Waymo early on in the study, I was struck by the extent to which they were talking about a technology that was quite well developed and quite sophisticated in what it could do, but they were very unwilling to let it outside of the test area that they'd set. As I say, we used to work on the major highways network for the UK, and I was thinking as they were talking, this thing could comfortably survive, I suspect, on the roads we've run right now. You could probably bring this today, and it would be fairly safe. But the question of being willing to take that risk was holding back its deployment. And that's going to continue to be a challenge throughout. So I suspect the time you will see level 4 automation coming onto the roads in a big way is when someone is willing to take the risk to actually put it out there. It's not going to necessarily just be a question of technology. It's going to be a question of the lawyers saying, this is a risk you can take now. And that's much harder to gauge.
Thank you, Michael. That's a terrific answer to an impossible question. I really appreciate that. We have some questions coming in. This question is from Suzanne. Creating an HD map is one thing. Keeping it updated is another. Some preliminary inquiries that they made among local authorities revealed that the cost of keeping data up to date, including on traffic regulations and so on, could be as much as the initial digitisation process. Do you have any comment or thought on that?
No, spot on. I'd agree. I say it would cost 10 million to go and do the UK motorway network. But I perhaps could have said it would cost 10 million a year forever to go and do it. That's still a reasonably manageable cost in the context of a major national highway network. It is harder for a local authority. And actually, you have quite a significant challenge, potentially, in a world where you are seeing this is something you want to operate across the whole network. There are some roads that it will not be cost effective to maintain that level of mapping upon, which is interesting from a policy point of view. It is easy to imagine this technology working well in the middle of a big global city like New York or Tokyo. It's much harder to imagine it was working in a small rural village under those conditions, unless government is stepping in behind to go and underwrite some of the cost in some way or another. Or there is some kind of framework to go and ensure an equitable sharing of surveying capacity. And then there are questions about how much do you want to go and make sure that you have repeated surveying to keep it up to date and live? Are there smarter ways around the problem? Are there ways of using data that's produced by the existing vehicle fleet, which I'm sure is possible, but isn't something that's been unpacked yet? It is something much more in the way of maintenance than it is of constructing something for the very first time. And that, I think, be a bit of a challenge for us as a profession, because that's, again, not quite the way we're used to operating with things that are quite so flexible and urgent.
Okay, thank you, Michael. If we talk about the sort of maintenance and of other forms of infrastructure, there's a question here from Gautier. What kind of performance do road markings need to have in order to be seen in any circumstances by automated vehicles? Do you have any insights on that from the study?
Well, yes, or rather, I have insights from other people that I can share, because I am not a roads engineer by any means. Two particular pieces of work spring to mind. I believe that USDOT was doing some work looking into this, or possibly it was Seattle, so it was Washington State Department of Transport, who was where they weren't, I think, able to find anything particularly significant about the standard of road markings that would need to change. In Australia, however, they looked into making wider markings that would be more visible, which I think were from memory a 6-inch width. I wouldn't want anyone to quote me on that. But the principle of having something bigger and bolder and brighter, made with sharper paint, was something they were exploring. So it's an area where there's investigation. And I think it's one of the more recognised areas for looking into the technical standards sooner rather than later. But I don't believe that there's an answer yet. The small caveat on that is that most of the field work we did on this was back in 2020, 2021. So it could be that someone has actually come up with a much better answer since then. And if so, I would salute them for their efforts.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. This is a question from Gonzalo. What are the steps needed to future-proof road infrastructure? We currently don't have a standard regarding the needs that each OEM has. How can we make these changes in the road network with a lifespan of multiple decades when we're not sure what's actually needed?
Yes, it's a very, very hard question. And we were worrying about it a lot with one project we were working on in the UK. We were thinking of digging a very large tunnel under one of our mountain ranges, and someone had asked the question, well, how wide does the tunnel need to be? If automated vehicles can drive closer together, do we need to think about a different lane width, or do we need to reserve space, or what should we do? I can't give you an answer, I'm afraid, because we genuinely don't know, I think, what the operating parameters of these vehicles are going to be. But the one thing I would draw some hope from is the fact that most developers are trying to fit their vehicles to the road rather than fit the road to their vehicles. And we might come to a point in 30 or 40 or 50 years in which we understand these vehicles so well, we can see an opportunity to do things differently. But for the foreseeable future, this is a technology that will fit with the roads that we've got, and we'll be pleased to do so. That is where the opportunity is commercially for anyone developing it. So questions that we have from the world of railways, for example, where we talk about gauge clearance and how wide the space around a train will be, is not going to be a relevant concept, I think, for most automated vehicle traffic. It might be conceivably a problem for some very rural, isolated roads or places where infrastructure is falling well below standard. But if you're on a purpose-built highway built in the latter half of the 20th century, you're almost certainly already compatible on the physical road space, at least. There is, however, a question you might want to ask about communications capacity in particular. The ability to go and get a large amount of data to and from these vehicles is probably going to be significant. In the UK, we've been building cabling alongside roads for a long time, well before automated vehicles came along. And I believe it's standard practice in much of the world nowadays, regardless. But certainly having some capacity for communications is probably the main thing to have in place.
Thank you very much. Another question here from Paul. Is there any environmental cost estimate for AVs in terms of energy requirements for computing power and air conditioning to cool the computing power?
I'm sure there is, but I'm afraid you're asking the wrong man on that one. That's not an area which I know that much about.
Okay, that's fine. These are all terrific questions, and they're all quite difficult questions. So I really appreciate the effort that's gone into them. Here's a question from Pascal. What are the recommended standards, if they exist yet, to communicate roadworks and other kinds of road disturbances to automated vehicles? I think I've got that question correct. Yeah.
Yes. So again, I must apologise that some of the work on here is a little out of date because of the time it took us to go and get to our final published version. My understanding is when we were working, there wasn't yet an agreed standard, but such material was coming together soon. I mean, to be honest, I suspect you probably know more than I do, Pascal, on this, because conscious of your long-standing interest in this field. I wouldn't want to mislead the audience by working through what I think is probably true, but I can't quite remember the fine detail of. There are certainly plans for bringing together standards for talking about some of the digital elements that we talked about in the report. So, for example, traffic regulation orders. There is the meta standard coming together, which will help to try and deliver some of this. I mean, if anyone would like to put in the Q&A, by the way, anything they have, because normally somebody's always got the bright answer somewhere in a conversation like this. I don't believe we have a standard for roadworks yet. In the UK context, I think we're looking at whether we would need to create something as an interim measure or not, but I could have that wrong.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. Just before we go to, we've got a couple of minutes left in our session. What I'd like to do now is to invite all of our attendees to fill in a quick poll, which contains 2 questions. The first of which is, did you find this webinar useful? Well, I know how I'm going to answer that in very, very positive affirmative. And based on your participation, would you be inclined to participate in future events? Thank you in advance for your responses to these questions, which really help us to improve the services that we, or the sessions that we provide. We have time for one last question here. I'm just going to check if there's been a response to your query in return about standards for roadwork alerts and so on. I don't see anything here. This is a comment which I will rephrase as a question from Cormac. And this is perhaps an area that may not have been covered in great detail in the report, but maybe you have an insight on it. Now, Cormac comments that shared mobility, car sharing and ride sharing are deserving of promotion and perhaps incentives and so on. Do you think that autonomous, electric, on-demand, door-to-door shared mobility is a desirable or perhaps even feasible solution at some point in the near future? Do you see that as being an important role for AVs?
I think it has huge potential, and I think the strongest case for adopting automation is probably safety, personally, partly because the vehicles will be smarter at avoiding collisions, but actually mainly because of how it will change our way of dealing with collisions as a profession. We will, like aviation, like railways, we will drive out death from our sector. And that for me is enough of a reason to think that this has been a very important development. But I do think that point-to-point automated passenger mobility is something that is plausible. So in a shared context, is plausible. I think it's particularly plausible if we can be intelligent about how we regulate the use of infrastructure. We had a think piece in the UK about what would you do if you wanted to build something that was the equivalent of our new Crossrail line, but using automated vehicles. And you could prove, as demonstrated, that you could actually get a much wider range of benefits across a large geography using that kind of technology. But you would have to limit access to certain key pieces of infrastructure to the right kind of vehicle. Then you would be able, hopefully, to create a charmed path through which the right kind of shared and electric mobility would be able to get to the destination you wanted to get to faster than anything else. And if you could do that, you create a compelling use case that millions of people hopefully will be willing to join in and do something with, and generate an incredibly powerful transport asset in the process. I mean, so if anyone's got sort of $10 billion sitting around idly, I've got a good use for it. So I think it can be done, but there is a caveat to that. The way in which this sector is developing, a lot of the exciting words of the mid-2010s were about how this was going to change the way we moved, as well as just how we drove, and how it was going to be this shared utopia. The way in which the industry has developed since then has focused mainly on making existing motor cars work in an automated way. That the complicated bits of sorting out a shared transport system, of creating the social elements behind it, changing mobility patterns, all these things are much harder to deliver. And if you are a startup company, you can't take that risk on. So if we want to see this more shared and electric and harmonious future, we actually have to go make it happen. It won't just occur naturally by accident. So there is an important role for governments around the world in trying to foster the right conditions and create situations where that will be a sensible business choice for somebody. Developers aren't expected to go and deliver the social outcomes that we want to try and do. They're there to go and turn a profit. You have to find a way to make that profit match your social goals.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I think that's an appropriate point at which to conclude the seminar today. Thank you to everybody for your excellent questions and some comments that have just come in the last couple of minutes, which we don't have time to get to now, but I'll certainly share those with Michael after the seminar today. Thank you once again, Michael, for taking the time to lead us through this very complex topic, but which you managed to elucidate and to explain to all of us here today in a very concise way. I thoroughly recommend that all of our viewers today go out and read this report. It's got a lot of details. It's got a lot of excellent recommendations for governments and a lot of thought-provoking examples of AVs in real life use. So thank you all again for your participation today. This recording will be made live on our YouTube channel so that you can come back to it at a later date. And I look forward to welcoming you at our next Ask the Author session. But it's goodbye for now. Thank you very much.